The morning sun barely peeked through the tall, glass windows of the FBI headquarters, casting a soft light on the sleek, modern building. Inside, agents hustled through the corridors, moving like clockwork through the structured, disciplined world of law enforcement. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Among them, Agent David Keller, a grizzled, middle-aged white man with a sharp jawline and a furrowed brow, walked slowly towards the briefing room. His worn-out shoes tapped softly against the polished floor, and his thoughts seemed a million miles away. Keller had been with the Bureau for nearly 2 decades, and he'd seen it all. A seasoned investigator, he knew how to read a room, how to sense when things were about to go south. And right now, something about the air felt thick, tense. Today, the tension wasn't about the criminals they were pursuing. It was about the new addition to his team, Agent Tasha Williams, a young, brilliant, and fiercely ambitious black woman, had just been assigned to the case. Keller didn't know much about her, but what he did know left him unsettled. As Keller entered the briefing room, his eyes briefly scanned the room. The team was already gathered around a long conference table, waiting for the meeting to begin. Agent Johnson, a young, clean-cut agent with a nervous smile, exchanged quick glances with Agent Parker, a more seasoned, but quietly resentful agent. Both agents were whispering and nodding, clearly talking about something Keller couldn't quite hear. And then there was Tasha Williams. She sat at the far end of the table, flipping through some files, her posture confident and poised. Keller couldn't help but notice how out of place she seemed in this setting. He tried to shake the feeling. After all, the Bureau was supposed to be a place of professionalism, where skills mattered more than appearances. But the nagging doubt remained. "Morning, everyone," Keller muttered, taking a seat. His voice was rough, as if his mind had already run through the day's grind. Tasha looked up, offering him a tight but sincere smile. "Good morning, Agent Keller." Keller nodded back, barely acknowledging her. His eyes shifted toward the front of the room as the briefing began. The projector hummed to life, casting a map of the city onto the wall. A voice filled the room, outlining the investigation into an elusive and dangerous criminal syndicate that had been terrorizing the city for months. The Bureau had tracked their movements to a few key locations, and now it was time to strike. As the briefing continued, Keller's attention wandered. His thoughts kept returning to Williams. Her calm demeanor, her confidence, her focus. It wasn't just that she was new to the team. It was the way some of the other agents looked at her. He caught Agent Parker rolling his eyes as she suggested a different angle for the operation. Keller glanced around the room and saw that others seemed to share Parker's unease. There were too many whispers, too many glances exchanged behind Williams' back. Tasha's proposal for how to move forward was met with silent resistance. Agent Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Agent Parker gave a dismissive laugh. "I'm not sure I follow. You think we should take a more aggressive approach?" Parker asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "Yes," Williams replied firmly. "We've been too reactive. If we want to catch them, we need to take control. Strike before they can make their next move." Keller stayed silent, but his thoughts began to churn. Williams was good. She had done her homework, and it showed. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't going to go smoothly with her on the team. Maybe it was the color of her skin. Maybe it was the quiet whispers and sideways glances from the others. The meeting ended, and the team began to filter out. Keller lingered by the door, watching Williams gather her things. He wanted to speak to her, but the words didn't come. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Keller walked alone down the narrow hallway, his mind racing. He could still hear the murmurs from the meeting echoing in his head. Comments about how Williams was too young, too inexperienced, too ambitious. His colleagues' words lingered, and he couldn't help but wonder if they were right. Keller had always been one to judge people based on their skills, not their background. But something about this situation felt different. Was it really about the skills? Or was it something deeper? Something uncomfortable that he couldn't quite name? Before he knew it, he found himself standing in front of the vending machine, staring blankly at the rows of snacks. His hand reached for a bag of chips, but his mind was elsewhere. "I'm not racist," Keller muttered to himself. as though trying to convince the quiet voice inside his head. But something in his gut told him that this wasn't just about a good agent. It was about a good agent being black, and how the team, including himself, would react to that. As he took a deep breath, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around to see Agent Johnson approaching, his expression both nervous and curious. "You think Williams is cut out for this?" Johnson asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Keller didn't respond right away. He looked Johnson dead in the eye. "I don't know. We'll see." But deep down, Keller already knew the answer. He just wasn't ready to admit it yet. That afternoon, the team gathered again for a tactical meeting. The subject was the next step in the investigation, a raid on a suspected safe house tied to the criminal syndicate. Williams, as expected, took the lead, presenting the strategy. She was calm, precise, and had clearly thought of every detail. But as she spoke, Keller couldn't help but notice the quiet murmurs from the other agents. Some rolled their eyes. Others exchanged skeptical glances. It was obvious they didn't want to follow her plan, not because it was flawed, but because she was the one leading it. "Are you sure about this?" Agent Parker asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Seems a little aggressive." "I'm sure," Williams replied firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "This is the best chance we have." Keller leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. There was something about Williams' confidence that unsettled him, but at the same time, he couldn't deny that she had a point. Her plan was solid, her reasoning sound, and yet, the tension in the room was undeniable. That evening, after the meeting, Keller found himself alone in his office, scanning the files for the next phase of the operation. His mind kept wandering back to Williams. In a quiet moment of introspection, he pulled up her file on his computer. It was impressive. Tasha Williams had an outstanding academic record, a perfect track record in her previous assignments, and a reputation for being sharp, driven, and capable. But it wasn't just her qualifications that caught his attention. It was her background. Tasha had grown up in a tough neighborhood where systemic injustice was a constant presence. She had fought her way through a system designed to hold her back, and now she was here, at the SBI, fighting the very same system from the inside. Keller couldn't help but feel a bit of admiration. But that feeling was soon replaced with discomfort. Her achievements, as remarkable as they were, had come at a high cost. And Keller knew that the world wasn't always fair, especially for someone like her. The next morning, the team prepared for the raid. Keller and Williams stood side by side, going over the final details. The tension between them was palpable. Keller, still uncertain, couldn't stop wondering if Williams was ready for the weight of what was about to happen. As they walked through the plan again, Williams gave precise instructions, while Keller hesitated. He wanted to support her, but something in his gut told him that this was all going to fall apart. "You've got this," Keller muttered, more to himself than to her. Williams looked at him with a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but she nodded. "Thanks." She wasn't sure if he truly meant it, or if he was just trying to convince himself. After hours, Keller and Williams sat in the dimly lit office, looking over the details of the operation once more. Keller was quiet, lost in thought. "I know you don't like me," Williams said suddenly, breaking the silence. Keller glanced up, surprised. "What are you talking about?" "You've been distant," Williams continued, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of frustration. "I know what people say. I can see it in their eyes." Keller sighed. "It's not that, Tasha. I don't know if you're ready for this. It's big." She stared at him for a long moment. "You're wrong, Keller. I've been ready my whole life." For the first time, Keller truly looked at her, not just as a colleague, but as someone who had fought far harder than he ever had to get here. The next morning, the team moved into position for the raid. The air was thick with anticipation. Keller stood next to Williams, watching as she took charge, directing the operation with poise and authority. When the dust settled, they had successfully apprehended several key members of the syndicate. The operation was a success. As they stood outside the building, the morning sun warming their faces, Keller looked at Williams with newfound respect. "You were right," he said quietly, "about everything." Williams nodded, but there was no smugness in her expression, only quiet acknowledgement. "You'll get there," she said. "One step at a time." And for the first time since they had met, Keller felt like they were finally on the same page. The city had a heartbeat all its own. It pulsed through the alleyways, the busy streets, the towering skyscrapers. The FBI's next operation took them to a new, dangerous territory. Ross, crime-ridden neighborhood, an area so tangled in the underworld that it seemed impossible to separate the good from the bad. Agent Keller stood near a nondescript van parked along the sidewalk, a camera in hand as he peered through the lens. The van was equipped with the latest surveillance technology, and he knew that they had to get this right. But as he glanced over at Agent Tasha Williams, who was adjusting her headset, he felt the familiar tension from their first few encounters rise again. She was ready. She was always ready, and that unsettled him. "Are you sure about this?" Keller asked, his voice low as he approached her. "This neighborhood's volatile. We can't afford any mistakes." Williams, sitting next to the surveillance monitor, didn't look up immediately. "I know this area well," she said, finally turning her gaze to him. "I grew up around places like this." Her calm response made Keller pause. It wasn't arrogance, it was confidence, and he couldn't help but feel a little impressed. Still, the look of determination in her eyes reminded him of something. She wasn't just doing this for the case. She was doing this to prove something. Keller nodded, though he remained wary. "Let's just stay sharp." They'd been tracking a criminal syndicate for weeks. Their prime suspect was a ruthless arms dealer operating out of a warehouse nearby. The plan was simple: observe, gather intelligence, and report back. But there was always a chance things would go sideways. As Keller and Williams set up the surveillance equipment, the tension in the air was thick. It wasn't just the criminals they were worried about. It was the people on the streets who might spot them and take issue with their presence, especially with Williams, who would stick out more in a neighborhood like this. As dusk began to fall, the streets started to bustle with activity. Cars slowed as they passed the van, eyes darting suspiciously toward the agents. Williams sat in the front seat, watching the monitors closely while Keller kept a lookout from the side. Suddenly, a group of local residents approached, their figures cutting through the shadows. They eyed the van, clearly suspicious of its presence. One man, larger than the others, noticed Williams sitting behind the tinted windows. He stepped forward, blocking her view with an intense glare. "You don't belong here, lady," the man sneered, his voice thick with disdain. "What? You think you're gonna change things, how?" Williams held his gaze, her face steady. She didn't back down. "I'm just here to do my job. You should keep moving." The man took a few steps closer, his tone growing more hostile. "Job? You're just one of them, ain't you? All you are is a pawn in the system." Keller, from his position, could sense things escalating quickly. He opened the van door and stepped out, his hand subtly resting near his sidearm. "Everything okay here?" Keller asked, his voice firm. He wasn't used to being the one to intervene, but he could feel the tension building. Williams didn't flinch. "It's fine, Keller," she said, her voice calm but stern. "I'll handle it." But the man wasn't backing off. He stepped even closer, his voice rising with contempt. "You don't belong in this neighborhood, especially not with a badge like that. Get out of here." Keller stepped forward, the space between him and the man closing. He didn't like it, but he couldn't let this get out of hand. "I said step back." The man hesitated, his eyes flicking between Keller and Williams. After a long, tense moment, he finally backed away. "Whatever, man. You'll see. Your kind never changes anything." As the man retreated into the night, Keller looked at Williams, who seemed unfazed. "Thanks for the assist," she said quietly. Keller hesitated. "Don't let them get to you. People like that, they don't know what they're talking about." Williams just nodded, but Keller noticed the way her jaw tightened. She didn't let it show, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. He wanted to say more but didn't know how. Hours later, as night fell and the operation continued, the situation took an unexpected turn. The team had been tracking a suspicious car that had just pulled up to the warehouse. Williams was focused on the screens, analyzing the vehicle's movements, when suddenly, the warehouse lights flickered. The hair on the back of Keller's neck stood up. "Something's wrong," Keller muttered. "We've been spotted." Before Williams could respond, The sound of gunfire erupted from the warehouse. It was a sharp, deafening sound that sent adrenaline flooding through Keller's veins. "Move now," Keller barked, throwing open the van door. They weren't prepared for this. No one was. But instinct kicked in. Keller grabbed his weapon and darted into cover, scanning for threats. Williams followed close behind, her eyes sharp as she surveyed the area. There was no time for hesitation. Gunshots echoed in the night air, but Keller's focus was on Williams. She was calm, calculating. She moved swiftly, taking charge in a way that impressed him, even as chaos erupted around them. They ducked behind a dumpster just as a barrage of gunfire exploded from the building. "We need to get out of here," Keller yelled, but Williams, already assessing the situation, held up a hand to stop him. "No, we can't leave yet. We're too close." Keller glanced at her, his face tight with concern. "Tasha, this isn't a negotiation." But Williams wasn't backing down. She kept her eyes locked on the warehouse, calculating their next move. She had already assessed the danger, and she knew they couldn't retreat without compromising the entire operation. The gunfire continued, but Williams saw an opening. She motioned to Keller to follow her, and they sprinted to the side of the building, staying low. Keller had never seen her so determined, so fearless. It was clear now. She wasn't just an agent. She was a force to be reckoned with. They made it to the back entrance of the warehouse, where the gunfire was louder. Keller's heart pounded in his chest as they took cover behind a set of crates, breathing heavily. "Ready?" Williams asked, her voice calm as ever. Keller nodded. "On your mark." They moved quickly, silently, entering the building from the rear as the shootout raged on at the front. Together, they cleared the building room by room, methodically, with precision. The criminals were caught off guard, and within minutes, they had secured the warehouse. The sound of sirens filled the night air as backup arrived, securing the area. Inside the warehouse, Keller and Williams stood over a handful of captured criminals. The tension between them was palpable, but there was a shift in the air. Keller could feel it. "You okay?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Williams was unscathed, but her body was tense, her eyes wide, alert. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. It was clear she was shaken, but she wouldn't admit it. "Not yet." Keller looked around at the wreckage. The operation had been more dangerous than expected, but they had made it out alive and successful. He felt a sense of pride in Williams' ability to keep her cool under pressure. "You did well," Keller said, breaking the silence. Williams glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Thanks, Keller, but we still have a lot to do." Her words hung in the air, and Keller nodded. He realized then that no matter what was going on inside his mind, Williams was in charge of this operation. She was the one who had made the call when it mattered most, and she had saved his life in the process. Back at the FBI office, Keller sat at his desk long after the operation had ended. He was staring at the case file on the screen, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying the events in his head. The way Williams had taken charge, how she had been unflinching in the face of danger. And then there was the hostile encounter earlier that night. Keller's thoughts kept returning to the way Williams had handled herself with such grace, despite the racial animus she faced. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was always walking a tightrope, balancing the expectations of her team, the weight of her race, and the dangerous realities of her job. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted. How could he, with all his years of experience, have missed something so simple? Williams had never needed to prove herself to him. She had already proven it to the world. A soft knock on his door broke his reverie. "Agent Keller?" It was Williams, standing in the doorway. "Come in," Keller said, his voice low. Williams stepped inside, her face still focused and determined. But this time, Keller saw something else in her eyes. A vulnerability, an openness. "You good?" Williams asked, her gaze softening. Keller sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I'm good. Just thinking about the operation. Thinking about you." Williams raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he meant. He leaned forward, meeting her eyes. "Tasha, you were right. This whole time, I've been wrong about you, and I need to apologize for that." I've been holding back, but you're the best agent on this team." Williams blinked, surprised by his words. For a moment, the walls between them seemed to crumble. "Thanks," she said softly, her voice sincere. "I just want to make sure we get the job done, together." And for the first time, Keller truly understood. The office was eerily quiet the morning after the raid. The adrenaline had worn off, and now the weight of the operation's consequences was beginning to settle in. The team was gathered in the debriefing room, but Keller felt a strange sense of unease, something he couldn't quite shake. Despite the success of the mission, something about the aftermath didn't sit right with him. Agent Williams sat at the far end of the table, reviewing the data from the warehouse. Her posture was impeccable, and her gaze never wavered as she typed up the report. Keller couldn't help but admire her composure, but he also recognized the exhaustion in her eyes. She had been through a lot the night before, but there was no sign of it on her face. The rest of the team was present, but there was a palpable tension in the room. Agent Parker sat across from Keller, his arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He hadn't spoken much since the raid. Agent Johnson, who had once been eager to impress, now seemed more withdrawn, his nervous energy replaced by an uncomfortable silence. As the briefing began, the tension between them was impossible to ignore. Parker, still skeptical of Williams, exchanged glances with Johnson. They had been critical of her the night before. But now, with their success fresh in their minds, their attitudes were quieter, more cautious. Williams spoke first, as if she were taking charge without asking for permission. "We've collected enough intel to track the rest of the syndicate's operations. We need to move fast to avoid losing momentum." Keller listened, nodding slowly, but his mind was elsewhere. He wanted to commend her, to tell the team how well she had performed under pressure, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself distracted by Parker's pointed stare, the one that made him feel like they were all waiting for something to go wrong. After the meeting, Keller found himself walking down the hallway with Williams, the two of them trailing behind the others as they headed to the elevator. The buzz of the fluorescent lights above them seemed louder than usual, amplifying the quiet discomfort between them. Keller was trying to find the right words, but the silence stretched on. Williams broke the silence first. "You think they're going to give us trouble on the next phase?" Keller hesitated. "Parker doesn't trust you. Neither does Johnson. But I think they'll fall in line. You've earned their respect." She gave him a brief, tired smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You think so?" "Yeah, I do. You proved yourself last night." Williams looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I didn't just prove myself, Keller. I proved them wrong. And that's something I'll have to do over and over again, just to keep my spot here." Keller stopped walking for a moment, taken aback by her bluntness. He had known, of course, that things would be harder for her than for him, but hearing it out loud was different. "I know, and that's not fair, but that's the reality. All you can do is keep pushing forward." She nodded, her face hardening with resolve. "I will, but it's exhausting, every day." Before Keller could respond, they reached the elevator. The doors opened, and the rest of the team filed in. The group was silent as the elevator ascended, the weight of their recent success hanging unspoken in the air. Keller stole a glance at Williams. She was staring straight ahead, her jaw tight, her eyes reflecting the same exhaustion he felt but was afraid to show. The tension between them was real, but for once, Keller didn't feel it was just because of their professional roles. It was deeper, personal. The next morning, Keller found himself alone in his office, staring at the stacks of paperwork. The quiet hum of the office was comforting in its mundanity, but the restlessness in his mind kept him from focusing. He couldn't stop thinking about Williams, about her courage, about the way she had taken charge during the raid, and the way her colleagues still viewed her. Keller had always prided himself on being a fair and unbiased agent, but he was starting to realize just how much of the world, and the FBI, was shaped by things beyond his control. He wasn't sure if it was because he was too close to the situation, or if it was because he wasn't ready to confront the truth about himself. But Keller found himself struggling to balance the image of the ideal agent he had in his mind and the reality of what Williams was up against every day. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his door. Without waiting for an invitation, Agent Parker stepped in, his face set in its usual expression of guarded resentment. "Got a minute?" Parker asked, his voice low. Keller gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Of course. What's up?" Parker sat down slowly, folding his arms as he regarded Keller with a sidelong glance. "I don't know what your deal is with Williams, but you need to be careful." Keller frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, she's got an agenda," Parker said, his eyes flicking toward the door. "She's good at her job, but I'm telling you, she's got something else driving her. It's not just about the work. You can't trust her." Keller's expression darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about. Williams is here to do her job, just like the rest of us. She's earned her place, Parker." Parker leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're too close to this. You don't see it. I'm not saying she's a bad agent, but she's got something to prove. And when someone's got something to prove, they'll do anything to get ahead." Keller's patience began to wear thin. "You're wrong, Parker. If anyone's got something to prove, it's you. Just because she's black doesn't mean she's out to sabotage everyone else." Parker's eyes widened, his jaw setting in anger. "I didn't say that." "No, but you implied it," Keller shot back. "I've seen how you look at her. I've seen the way you treat her. You're better than that." For a long moment, Parker didn't speak. Keller's words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Finally, Parker spoke again, though his voice was quieter now. "Just watch yourself, Keller. Watch your back." "What's that?" Parker stood up and left the room without another word. Keller watched him go, feeling the weight of his warning settle in his chest. He couldn't ignore the fact that Parker wasn't wrong about everything, but he also couldn't let it fester. The truth was, Williams had earned her place in the FBI, no matter what anyone else thought. Later that day, Keller found himself standing outside the building, waiting for Williams to finish up a meeting with one of the other teams. The crisp autumn air cut through his jacket as he stared out at the city skyline, lost in thought. He wasn't expecting to see Agent Johnson approach, but the young agent made his way toward Keller, an unsure look on his face. "You got a minute, Keller?" Johnson asked, glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was watching. Keller raised an eyebrow. "Sure. What's going on?" Johnson shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about the way I've treated Williams." Keller looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Johnson swallowed. "I've been, I don't know, a little judgmental. I didn't think she belonged here at first, but after everything that happened last night, I see it now. She's not just here because of some diversity quota. She's here because she's good at what she does. Hell, she saved my ass out there." Keller nodded slowly. "I appreciate you saying that. But it's not just about what happened last night. You need to realize that Williams is facing something none of us have to deal with. Every day is harder for her than it is for any of us. But she's not going to back down. She never does." Johnson looked away, nodding. "Yeah, I get that now. It's hard. For all of us." Keller clapped him on the shoulder, giving him a reassuring nod. "You'll figure it out. We all will." As Johnson walked away, Keller stood there for a moment longer, his thoughts returning to Williams. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together in his mind. He didn't know what the future held for them, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her face this alone. That evening, Keller and Williams found themselves sitting side by side at a bar near the FBI office. It was the first time since the raid that they had shared a quiet moment, away from the chaos of their jobs. Williams sipped her drink, her eyes thoughtful as she stared into the amber liquid. Keller, ever the silent observer, studied her for a moment before speaking. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what happened last night," Keller said, his voice low. Williams looked up at him, her face softening. "You're not going to apologize again, are you?" Keller shook his head. "No, but I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're on this team. I'm not going to lie. I've had my doubts, but after everything, I see it now. You're the one keeping us grounded." Williams didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. Finally, she gave a slight nod. "It means a lot to hear you say that," she said quietly. "I know it hasn't been easy, But I'm here for this team. And for you. We're in this together. Keller smiled. Yeah, we are. And for the first time, Keller truly felt like he was no longer just standing on the sidelines. He was ready to stand with Williams, as an equal, as a partner. No more doubts. No more hesitation. Together, they were stronger. And together, they would face whatever challenges came next. The tension in the office was almost tangible the next morning. The raid on the arms syndicate had been successful, but their work was far from over. New intelligence had surfaced, a lead on a bigger, more dangerous operation, one that could put the entire city at risk. And this time, it wasn't just about the syndicate. This was personal. Agent Williams sat in the briefing room, her face illuminated by the glow of the presentation screen. Keller stood beside her, looking over the information she was about to share with the team. They had been at this for days now, piecing together bits of intelligence from various sources, trying to make sense of it all. The operation we're tracking involves a corrupt network inside the city government. Williams began, her voice steady. We've identified several key players, council members, city officials, and they're connected to the syndicate we've been after. This isn't just a street gang anymore. This is a system-wide problem. The team listened intently, but the air in the room shifted. Keller noticed the unease in the room as Williams spoke, particularly the wariness of Agent Parker. Williams was clearly the one in charge now, and she carried herself like she knew it. We don't know the full extent of their connections, Williams continued. But we do know this. If we can break this, we can take down both the syndicate and the corrupt officials at the same time. This is the big one. Keller could feel the weight of her words. There was no turning back now. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the target was no longer just criminals. It was the system itself. Later that afternoon, Keller and Williams were reviewing the plan in her office. Keller, as always, was trying to catch every detail, every nuance of the operation. The weight of it all felt heavier now, especially after what had happened with the team in the briefing room. I know you're not happy about this, Williams said, breaking the silence between them. Keller raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about? Williams exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. You saw the way Parker reacted. And Johnson, too. They don't trust me. And I know it's only going to get worse as we go further into this. Keller hesitated before speaking. You know I've got your back, right? This is about the job, not about anyone's personal feelings. We can do this, but we need to stay focused. Williams nodded, but there was a trace of doubt in her expression. It's not just about the job. It's about making sure we don't lose ourselves in this. I can't do this without you, Keller. Not the way I know how. Keller didn't know how to respond. He was beginning to realize that this case, this moment, was changing things for both of them. It wasn't just about following protocol. It wasn't just about the mission. For Williams, this was personal, and for Keller, the lines were beginning to blur. That evening, they had a break in the case. A small but significant piece of the puzzle. Agent Williams, Keller, and the rest of the team gathered in the operations room to go over the new intelligence. The data had come from an anonymous source, but it was enough to lead them to a key player in the corrupt government network. Meet Richard Colton, Williams said, her finger hovering over the image of a well-dressed man on the screen. City council member. On paper, he's a well-respected public servant. But according to our source, he's also one of the people moving money for the syndicate, laundering it through city contracts. The team fell silent as the implications of this began to sink in. Colton wasn't just a criminal. He was an insider, someone who had been hiding in plain sight for years. Keller leaned in closer. How do we get to him? Williams tapped a few keys on the computer, pulling out more documents. Our contact says Colton is set to meet with one of the syndicate's higher-ups tomorrow night. We need to move fast. If we can intercept that meeting, we'll have everything we need to take him down. Keller was already mentally preparing for the next steps, but something nagged at him. A gut feeling, something he couldn't quite put into words. This was bigger than they thought. The plan was set. The team would follow Colton's every move, monitoring him in real time as they closed in on the meeting with the syndicate. They had everything in place, surveillance teams, tactical units, but when the time came, something went wrong. Williams and Keller were in a stakeout van across from Colton's apartment, watching for any sign of movement. The rest of the team was spread out, ensuring no one would be able to tip Colton off. "Everything's clear on my end," Keller said into the radio. "We're just waiting for him to make a move." But as the minutes ticked by, Keller felt an unsettling sense of anticipation. Something about this felt off. Suddenly, a blaring alarm pierced the quiet of the van. It was a breach. Someone had intercepted their surveillance. Someone knew they were watching. "Shit," Keller cursed, grabbing his gear. "We've been compromised. Get ready to move now." Williams was already moving, her expression hardening. "This isn't good. Stay sharp." They rushed out of the van, but it was too late. The syndicate had already started moving their operation into overdrive. Colton's meeting had been a setup, a trap, and now Keller and Williams were caught in the middle of it. The chase was fast and unforgiving. Keller and Williams ran down alleyways, barely dodging gunfire as they made their way toward the rendezvous point. The rest of the team was in pursuit, but they were losing ground. The syndicate's enforcers were everywhere. Just as they neared the target building, a black SUV screeched to a halt beside them, and Agent Parker emerged, his face tight with something unreadable. He was supposed to be miles away, coordinating from a secondary location. "Get in," Helko barked. "We're pulling out. Now." Keller hesitated for just a moment. "What the hell are you doing here? You're not supposed to be on this level of the operation." Parker's eyes flicked to Williams, then back to Keller. "We've got a problem. Colton's not just an informant. He's a damn plant. This whole operation was set up to take us down." Keller felt his stomach twist as realization dawned. Parker wasn't just a teammate trying to help them out. He had been working with the enemy. "You son of a..." Keller started. But before he could finish, the sound of gunfire erupted nearby. They had no choice but to dive into the SUV. As the vehicle sped away, Keller and Williams exchanged a tense look. Parker was part of the corruption they had been fighting all along. Keller's mind raced. Everything he thought he knew about this mission had been shattered in an instant. Back at the safe house, the team regrouped. Keller stood apart from the others, his mind reeling. Parker was one of them now, had been all along, and everything about the operation had been a lie. They couldn't trust anyone anymore. Williams stepped up to him, her eyes sharp. "We need to figure out our next move. We can't just sit here." Keller looked at her, a flash of guilt crossing his face. "I should have seen it. I should have known." Williams gave him a hard look. "You weren't the only one fooled. We've all been in the dark." Keller clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "What now, Tasha? What do we do?" Williams didn't hesitate. "We keep going. We get Colton. We take down the rest of them. And we don't let Parker, or anyone else, stop us." Keller looked at her, seeing the fire in her eyes. For the first time since this whole mission began, he wasn't questioning her ability. He was trusting her fully. "Let's get to work," he said, his voice steady. They were down to just the two of them. Everyone else was compromised, and the case had gone too deep for any hope of reinforcement. But in this moment, Keller and Williams were the last line of defense, and that meant the rest of the city was counting on them. They had a plan: get to Colton before he could escape the city. But it wasn't just about bringing him in now. It was about sending a message to the people who thought they could destroy everything they had worked for. "We'll do this the right way," Williams said quietly as they prepared to move. "And if it costs us everything, then so be it." Keller nodded. He was with her. He had always been with her, but now it was clearer than ever. They had a purpose, a shared goal that was bigger than the shadows closing in on them. As they suited up and prepared to leave, Keller turned to her one last time. "You know, I never understood what you were up against before, but I get it now, and I'll never leave you to face it alone." Williams gave him a small, determined smile. "I know." And together, they would fight on. The night was cold, the air thick with tension as Keller and Williams raced against time. Colton had vanished. His connections were pulling him deeper into the city's underbelly, and their only chance at stopping him was to intercept him before he could escape with critical evidence. Keller was behind the wheel of the SUV, eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. Williams was next to him, scanning the streets through the passenger window, every nerve on edge. They'd been tracking Colton's movements for hours, and they were closing in, but something felt off. Williams leaned forward, her hand gripping the seat, her focus razor-sharp. He's not heading to the airport, Keller. He's doubling back. Keller swore under his breath. We can't let him slip through our fingers again. We need to catch him now. The lights of the city blurred around them as they sped through narrow alleyways, the sound of their tires screeching as they cut corners. They were getting closer. Colton's car was just ahead, weaving through traffic. Suddenly, another vehicle, an unmarked black van, pulled out from a side street, cutting them off. The van's door swung open, and masked men jumped out, weapons drawn. It was a setup. Shit. Keller slammed on the brakes, swerving the SUV to avoid a head-on collision. The sound of gunfire erected, shattering the quiet of the night. Williams reacted immediately, drawing her weapon and returning fire. Get us out of here, Keller. Keller gunned the engine, swerving to dodge another round of gunfire. Sold on. The streets were a maze of chaos as they sped away, the sound of pursuing vehicles echoing in the distance. They had to lose them, and fast. But as they rounded another corner, the black van reappeared in their rearview mirror, closer this time. We're not gonna outrun them, Keller shouted, gripping the wheel tightly. Williams's eyes were narrowed, calculating. We don't need to outrun them. We need to stop them. Without warning, she flung open the door, a flash of determination in her eyes. Cover me. Before Keller could protest, she was out of the car and sprinting towards a nearby alley. Keller cursed under his breath but followed, weaving through the streets, barely dodging incoming bullets. He caught up with her just as she reached a narrow alley that led toward a dead end. Williams turned in. We need to end this now. You're with me? Keller nodded, ready for whatever came next. I'm with you. Together, they braced themselves. Their pursuers were closing in, and if they didn't act fast, the trap would be complete. The trap was more than just a few men with guns. The van they had been chasing screeched to a halt, and Agent Parker emerged, a cold smirk on his face. Behind him, two other figures in tactical gear joined him. Keller's heart sagged. Parker. Williams's grip on her weapon tightened. You sold us out. Parker's eyes glinted with something dark. You were always a step behind, Keller. You were never going to get Colton. Not when I'm in the game. We were never going to win this, and you should have known it. Keller couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're with him? After everything we've been through? You were part of the team. Parker laughed, a hollow sound. You think I'm some kind of hero? I've been playing the game from the start. And now, I get to walk away with a fortune. Colton's just the beginning. Williams stepped forward, her voice cold as steel. You're going to pay for this, Parker. You and the rest of them. Parker's smirk didn't falter. You think you can stop me? You're alone out here. You're both dead, just like your mission. Just then, the sound of multiple vehicles screeching to a halt filled the alley. The rest of the syndicate's enforcers poured out, surrounding them. Keller's heart pounded. They were outnumbered, surrounded. This was it. But before he could act, Williams raised her hand, signaling for him to stay calm. Her voice was steady, unwavering. We're not backing down. We're taking you down, Parker. Keller glanced at her, their eyes locking. In that moment, he knew. They were both willing to die for this. They had no other choice. The alley was filled with tension as both sides squared off, weapons drawn. Parker's men were behind him, but Williams and Keller were not backing down. Despite being outnumbered, there was something fierce in their eyes, a shared understanding that they couldn't lose. Not now. Not after everything. Make your move, Keller, Parker said with a mocking tone. You think you can take me down? You're not getting out of this alive. Keller's hand hovered near his gun. I'm not going to let you win, Parker. Without warning, Williams sprinted forward, charging toward one of Parker's men with lightning speed. A gunshot rang out, but she was already ducking, using the element of surprise to her advantage. Keller followed suit, taking cover behind a dumpster and opening fire. It was a blur of chaos, gunfire, shouts, and the sound of metal clashing against concrete. Keller felt the rush of adrenaline coursing through him. He was no longer thinking, just reacting. Each shot was instinctive, each move a reflex. And still, They were closing in. Williams, despite being outnumbered, fought like a force of nature. She was everywhere at once, moving with precision and power, disarming one of Parker's men with a quick kick and sending him sprawling. Her eyes were wild, relentless. The fight continued until it became clear Parker's men were losing. Keller and Williams were slowly pushing them back. Finally, Keller took down the last of the syndicate enforcers with a well-placed shot. There was a moment of silence before Keller and Williams turned their attention back to Parker, who was now retreating into the shadows, realizing he had been bested. But before Keller could follow, Williams stepped forward. "He's not worth it." Keller turned to her. "We can't let him get away." Williams shook her head. "We've already won. We've taken them down. Let him run, Keller. He'll face justice, and we'll make sure of it." For a moment, Keller hesitated. He wanted to finish this, wanted to see Parker behind bars. But something in Williams's eyes told him that the battle was over, that chasing Parker any further would be a waste of what they had achieved. Back at their temporary base, the aftermath of the battle hung heavy in the air. The team was scattered, their spirits bruised but not broken. Colton had been captured, the evidence had been secured, and the syndicate was unraveling. But for Keller and Williams, the battle was far from over. The next day, as they sat in the debriefing room, the weight of their decisions loomed large. They had succeeded, but they had also lost pieces of themselves along the way. Keller turned to Williams, his voice quieter than usual. "You were right about him. About Parker." Williams nodded, her gaze distant. "It's never easy to accept when someone you trusted betrays you. But we've done what we came here to do. We've exposed them all." Keller leaned back in his chair. "I've been thinking about what's next. For both of us." Williams raised an eyebrow, a quiet curiosity in her expression. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what happens after all this? After the mission ends? We've both changed, Williams. I don't know where we go from here." She was silent for a long moment before speaking. "I don't know either. But what I do know is that we fought for something real. And that's enough for me." Keller smiled slightly, a rare moment of peace crossing his face. "Yeah, it's enough." They shared a quiet understanding, the weight of everything they had faced settling in. The city was still in turmoil, the work still unfinished. But for now, Keller and Williams knew that they had each other. And as long as they stood together, they could face whatever came next. The days after the confrontation with Parker were filled with quiet tension. The city felt on edge, but there was a sense of unfinished business in the air. Keller and Williams had won their battles, but the war was far from over. In the aftermath, they sat at a makeshift command center, the walls lined with maps, photos, and case files. The air smelled of stale coffee and unspoken questions. The leads on Colton's network were just the beginning, and the ramifications of what they had uncovered were far-reaching. Williams flipped through the files with deliberate focus. "Colton's connections go deeper than we thought. He's been laundering money through half of the city's contracts, using political leverage to cover his tracks. We need to dismantle the entire system." Keller stood nearby, pacing as he absorbed the new intel. "I know, but we can't do it alone. Not with the people who were supposed to be on our side turning against us." Williams didn't meet his eyes at first, but Keller could feel the weight of her words in the silence. "We'll keep going. We've already exposed enough to bring down Colton and the people working with him. But we need to be careful. The higher-ups are going to fight back, and they'll use everything at their disposal to protect themselves." Keller's voice softened, but his resolve hardened. "We've already lost too much. We can't back down now. Not when we're so close." But Williams only nodded, the hint of a weary smile touching her lips. She was as committed as he was. But Keller could tell. There was a tension in her he hadn't seen before. She knew the next step was going to test them in ways they hadn't imagined. A few hours later, the phone rang in the command center. Williams answered, her expression unreadable. "Agent Williams," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. After a brief pause, her eyes widened slightly. Keller approached, sensing something had shifted. "Who is it?" Williams hung up the phone, her face conflicted. "That was Samuel Banks, the one who tipped us off about Colton." Keller furrowed his brow. "Banks? The whistleblower?" Williams nodded slowly. "He's in trouble. He says he has information that could take down everyone involved. But he's in hiding. He needs our help. Keller looked skeptical. We don't know if we can trust him. After everything that's happened, I'm not sure we can trust anyone anymore. I know, Williams replied, her voice quiet but firm. But if Banks has what he says he does, it could be the missing piece we need. We can't afford to ignore it. Keller paused, considering. All right, but we're going in cautiously. No mistakes this time. The night was colder than usual when they met Banks in the underground parking garage of a dilapidated building. The low hum of distant traffic filled the empty space, but there was an unsettling quiet to the place. Banks, a middle-aged man with ragged clothes and a nervous energy about him, stepped out of the shadows. He looked over his shoulder before walking toward Williams and Keller. "You're sure you want to do this?" Banks asked in a whisper, his voice trembling. "Because once you hear what I've got, there's no turning back." Keller took a step forward, his expression hard. "Just tell us what you know." Banks hesitated, glancing around again. "I've been watching Colton and his people for a long time. What you don't understand is, Colton isn't just some politician. He's tied to something bigger. There's an international syndicate behind all of this, bigger than any city, any government. And they're looking to take control of more than just arms deals. They're pushing to destabilize the country." Williams's eyes narrowed. "What does Colton have to do with all this?" "He's their link to the city," Banks said, his voice lowering. "But the truth is, Colton's just the tip of the iceberg. There are people in high places, top law enforcement, even government officials, who are working for this syndicate. Colton is the frontman, but they've already infiltrated the system." Keller felt the gravity of Banks's words weigh on him. "Are you telling me this goes all the way to the top?" Banks swallowed hard. "Yes. And they're moving quickly. If you don't stop them now, they'll have complete control. And there's nothing anyone can do about it." Williams exchanged a look with Keller. This was worse than they had imagined. "What do you want from us?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Banks held out a flash drive. "This contains everything, their operations, their network, all the names. If you give this to the right people, it's over for them. But you have to act fast." Keller hesitated for a moment, then reached out and took the drive. He could feel the weight of it in his hand, a key to a far-reaching conspiracy that could unravel the nation's fabric. "Thank you," Williams said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty. "We'll take it from here." As they walked away, Keller's mind was racing. This was it. This could be the end of everything, or the beginning of something far worse. Back at their base, they plugged the drive into a secure computer, and what they found was beyond their worst fears. Hundreds of files, encrypted documents, and names. The syndicate wasn't just operating in the shadows of the city. They were embedded in the highest echelons of power. Lawmakers, judges, police chiefs, military officials. Williams's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her face pale as she reviewed the information. "This is bigger than we thought, Keller. This goes all the way to the White House. They've been orchestrating this for years." Keller's mind raced as he took in the breadth of the conspiracy. "So what do we do now? We're not equipped to take on the entire system. If we expose this, they'll come after us. And they'll make sure we disappear." Williams met his gaze. "We don't have a choice. We've already started this, and we've lost too much to walk away now." Keller hesitated. "But the stakes are higher than they've ever been. We're not just fighting criminals anymore. We're up against an entire network of corruption. We can't do this alone." Williams set her jaw, determination flooding her veins. "We don't have to do it alone. We've got the truth on our side. And we've got people who trust us, people who believe in what we're doing." Keller knew she was right. They had allies. And with the information they had, they could take down the syndicate, piece by piece. But it wouldn't be easy. And the fight would cost them more than they were ready to give. The following days were a blur of secret meetings, encrypted messages, and long hours. Keller and Williams began reaching out to their most trusted allies, though still on the right side of the law. But they knew time was running out. As they prepared to present their findings to the public, the city began to feel different. The walls seemed to close in around them. Everywhere they turned, they felt the eyes of the syndicate watching, waiting. They had been discovered. The storm was coming, And soon, their worst fears were realized. Late one night, as they returned to their base, they found it ransacked. Files were missing. The computers had been wiped clean. And the message was clear. The syndicate knew what they were planning. "They're coming for us," Cheller muttered, his voice low and cold. "We've got no time left." Williams didn't flinch. She was already thinking ahead, formulating a plan. "We move now. We take this fight to the streets. We show them we're not backing down." Keller nodded, his resolve steeled. "Let's end this." With their backs against the wall and their resources dwindling, Keller and Williams made their final move. They knew that exposing the syndicate's network was the only way to stop them. They had no choice but to go public with the information, even if it meant risking everything. But the final confrontation was more than just a matter of exposing corruption. It was a matter of survival. As they prepared to broadcast the truth, they knew the entire city, and possibly the country, would be watching. In a dramatic broadcast that shook the city to its core, Keller and Williams went public. They shared the files, the evidence, the names, everything. The truth was out, and the world would never be the same again. The fallout was immediate. People began to rise up, demanding justice. The authorities scrambled to contain the damage, but it was too late. The syndicate's power had been shattered, and although Keller and Williams knew that they had won, they also knew the fight wasn't over. They had started something that couldn't be undone, and as the dust settled, Keller looked at Williams, a quiet understanding between them. "We did it," he said. Williams nodded, a rare smile crossing her face. "We did." They had faced darkness together, and now, for the first time in a long time, the light was beginning to break through. And though they knew the battle was never truly over, they had proven that truth and justice could still prevail. The dust from their final battle had barely settled, and already Keller and Williams could feel the weight of the consequences. The streets of the city were flooded with protests and rallies, a mixture of fear, anger, and hope. People had come out in droves to demand accountability for the corruption that had been exposed. It was clear that the fight they had waged was only the beginning. Inside a safe house, the two agents watched the news coverage in silence. The broadcast of the syndicate's unraveling had sent shockwaves through the nation. Politicians, high-ranking law enforcement officers, and military leaders had been implicated. But the victory felt hollow. "It's over, but it feels like we're just getting started," Williams said, her voice low. She was staring at the television, but her mind was far away. Keller nodded, his expression weary. "We've done what we set out to do. The syndicate's in disarray, but we're not safe yet. Not until everything settles. We expose the truth, Keller. That's what matters." Williams's voice carried the faintest hint of hope. Keller's gaze drifted to the files strewn across the table. Their work wasn't done. The network might be collapsing, but there were still loose ends. Agents who hadn't been arrested, politicians still in power, and deep, uncharted territories they had yet to navigate. There were still people out there who would fight to keep the system in place. "I know, but I'm worried," Keller admitted, rubbing his temples. "We've made a lot of enemies, and not all of them are going to lay low." Williams looked at him with a sharp, knowing gaze. "I've had that same feeling, but we can't back down now. We exposed the whole network. The people who have been enabling them, they're on notice. The country is watching. We can't let them bury the truth." Keller nodded, though his unease lingered. "You're right, but I'm afraid that the fallout will be bigger than we can handle." The following week was a blur. Keller and Williams were busy preparing for the next phase of their fight, ensuring the exposure of the syndicate stuck. But there was a growing sense of unease as both of them felt the isolation of being in the spotlight. The authorities, though shaken by the revelations, were still reeling from the scandal. Many of those who had once been allies were now under suspicion or on the defensive. One evening, a familiar face arrived at their safe house. Agent Evan Harper, a trusted colleague from the FBI, walked in with a tense expression. "I need to speak with you both," he said, his tone serious, his eyes scanning the room nervously. Keller and Williams exchanged a glance before sitting across from Harper. Keller leaned forward, trying to read him. "What's going on, Evan?" Harper hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "There are rumors circulating. Some people in high positions are already working to bury what you've exposed. They don't want the truth out there, and they're willing to do anything to make it go away. Williams's jaw tightened. I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Who exactly are we talking about? Harper looked around, ensuring no one was listening before leaning in. It's more than just the syndicate members you exposed. There are people who were part of that network who are still in power. Senators, governors, even some members of the FBI. Keller's stomach dropped. He had feared this. You mean to say they're trying to protect their own? Harper nodded. Exactly. They'll do anything to destroy the evidence, discredit you both, and silence anyone involved. And they've got resources, money, influence, and people who can make you disappear if it comes to that. Williams clenched her fists. How do we stop them? Harper's face was grim. There's a small faction within the government that's trying to make sure this gets investigated properly. But they're outnumbered. If you don't act fast, they'll get shut down too. Keller's mind raced. They had two options. Go public and risk their lives even further, or go underground and fight back from the shadows. Neither was ideal. We need to get to the people who are still loyal, Keller said, his voice resolute. We can't do this alone. We need to build a coalition. Lawyers, journalists, anyone who can expose the truth and get it out to the public. Harper nodded. But we have to move quickly. The walls are closing in. That evening, as they strategized their next move, Keller and Williams received a call that would change everything. A heavily encrypted message came through from an anonymous source. You don't know me, but I know you. The next few days are crucial. There's an operation coming that could put you both in danger. The people in power are coming after you. They've set a trap, and you're about to walk right into it. Williams's hand shook as she read the message. This is bad. They know our every move. Keller immediately picked up the phone. We need to know more. Who's behind this? The voice on the other end was distorted, and it carried a sense of urgency. Don't trust Harper. He's been compromised. He's working for them. I've been trying to warn you. Trust no one but yourselves. You need to disappear, now. The government is about to move against you. The line went dead. Keller looked at Williams, his face pale. Did you hear that? They said Harper's compromised. He's one of them. Williams was stunned. She had always trusted Harper. No, that can't be true. He's been with us since the beginning. I don't know, but this is bigger than we thought. Keller stood up, moving toward the door. We need to find out who we can trust. And we need to do it fast. The next morning, Keller and Williams made the decision to confront Harper. But when they arrived at his apartment, they found it ransacked. There was no sign of him, no trace of his whereabouts. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. God damn it, Keller cursed. He's gone. Williams's eyes were cold, a steely resolve setting in. We need to find out where he went. If he's working with them, we can't let him take us down. They scoured the building, checking every detail. It didn't take long before they found a hidden compartment in the back of Harper's closet, containing documents and a burner phone. The files were filled with encrypted messages, confirming that Harper had indeed been in contact with the syndicate. We've been played, Williams said quietly, her face hard. He's been feeding them information, every step of the way. Keller didn't respond right away. His anger was boiling over, but it was tempered by something darker. A sense of betrayal that cut deeper than the battle they'd been fighting. He trusted Harper. They had all trusted him. But the revelation didn't surprise him. It was just one more layer of corruption to uncover. We'll find him, Keller said, his voice tight. And we'll make him pay for this. With Harper now an enemy, Keller and Williams had no choice but to go underground. They had been left with little support, few people they could trust, and every step they took was now a calculated risk. The government had turned its back on them, and their every move was being watched. In the few moments they had alone, they knew their options were dwindling. We have to act fast, Williams said, her voice low. There are still people out there who want to stop this from going public. If we don't get to them first, they'll come after us. Keller clenched his jaw. We'll take down the whole damn system if we have to. The truth needs to come out, no matter the cost. After days of careful planning, Keller and Williams made their move. They went to the one place they hadn't dared venture before, the heart of the government. Armed with the evidence they had gathered, they infiltrated a high-security facility, determined to expose the truth once and for all. As they stood in the shadows, prepared to bring down the last pillars of corruption, Keller turned to Williams. Their faces were grim, but there was a shared understanding between them. "We've come this far," Keller said, his voice low but filled with a quiet certainty. Williams met his gaze. "We're doing this for the people, for the future. No matter what happens, we have to see it through." They walked toward the doors that would lead them to the heart of the conspiracy. Whatever was on the other side, they knew they would face it together. The city was bathed in the cold glow of the early morning light as Keller and Williams made their way to the heart of the government facility. It was quiet, eerily so. This was the last place they thought they'd be, deep inside the very system they had spent months trying to dismantle. But here they were, determined to bring the truth to light once and for all. The facility was high-tech, layered with security checkpoints and encrypted doors. But Keller and Williams knew how to navigate them. They had studied the blueprints for days, anticipated the guards' schedules, and worked every angle. Still, as they made their way down the dimly lit hallways, a sense of unease gnawed at them. The air felt thick with tension. They arrived at the vault-like room that housed the government's most sensitive files, documents on national security, covert operations, and the deep corruption that had taken root. This was where the final evidence was locked away, where it would all either end or be buried forever. "You ready?" Williams asked, her voice a whisper, but steady. Keller didn't respond right away. He was focused on the task ahead. The truth was just beyond that door, but so were the people who would do anything to prevent it from being exposed. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Let's finish this." He inserted a flash drive into the hidden terminal next to the reinforced door. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a sterile, cold room filled with servers, databanks, and stacks of documents. At the far end of the room, a single desk sat beneath a harsh fluorescent light, the hard drive that contained all the government's secrets glowing ominously in the center of the desk. They stepped inside cautiously, their hearts pounding as they surveyed the room. Keller immediately moved toward the desk, his eyes scanning the room for hidden cameras or security triggers. Williams lingered by the door, watching the hallway. She knew that while they were close to the end, the real danger was yet to come. "Do it," she whispered. Keller sat at the desk, his fingers flying over the keyboard. He'd been here before. He knew what to do. The software they had smuggled in would bypass the encryption and give them access to everything. Documents that tied the syndicate to government officials, names of operatives, financial transactions, everything. All they had to do was upload the files to the outside world, to the public. Suddenly, the system flashed red. An alarm blared, sending a sharp jolt of panic through Keller. He immediately disconnected the flash drive, but the damage had already been done. Someone knew they were here. "Get out," he shouted to Williams, rising from the desk and rushing toward the door. But before they could move, the doors slammed shut. The voice of Director Benjamin Lockhart, the man who had orchestrated the entire operation to protect the syndicate, came through a hidden speaker, cold and calculated. "You really thought you could win?" Lockhart's voice echoed in the room, his tone smug. "You've exposed the tip of the iceberg, but you've played right into my hands. You can't stop what's already been set in motion. You've been a thorn in my side long enough." Keller's heart raced, but he held his ground. "You're not getting away with this. We'll expose you, Lockhart. People already know the truth. You still don't understand, do you?" Lockhart's voice was now laced with venom. "I'm the system. Without me, this country collapses. You've done nothing but expose the rot in the system. Now, you'll pay the price." Before Keller could respond, the door to the room opened, and armed agents flooded in, led by none other than Agent Evan Harper. He stepped forward, his eyes locking with Keller's. His face was hard, a look of betrayal etched deep into his features. "I told you, you couldn't win," Harper said, his voice a twisted mockery of their old camaraderie. "But now, you're out of options." Keller's stomach dropped as Harper stepped forward, his gun drawn and aimed directly at them. There was no hiding it now. Harper had been working with Lockhart all along, Everything they had worked for, the late nights, the dangerous missions, the sacrifices, had been for nothing. "You've been lying to us the whole time," Williams said, her voice cold but sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. Harper didn't flinch. "You never knew how deep it went, did you? I'm part of something much bigger than you. All you did was make a few waves in a pond you'll never understand." Keller clenched his fists. "You think this is over? You think we won't bring this to the world?" Harper smirked. "The world doesn't want the truth, Keller. They want order. They want control. They don't care about a few rogue agents." Suddenly, there was a sharp click, and Keller felt a sudden surge of fear as the barrel of Harper's gun wavered. But before anyone could react, Williams lunged forward. She knocked Harper's hand aside, causing the bullet to miss its mark and ricochet off the walls. The agents in the room reacted instantly, drawing their weapons. "You don't get to walk away from this," Williams hissed, struggling to maintain control of Harper's gunner. Harper snarled, pushing her away. But his movements were slower now, more calculated. The agents closed in on Keller and Williams, their weapons aimed. But Keller saw an opportunity. He dashed toward the computer terminal, slamming his fist onto a nearby console, triggering an emergency backup. Within seconds, a message flashed on the screen. "Critical data uploaded. Public access granted." "We've already won," Keller spat, glaring at Lockhart and Harper. "The data's out there. It's too late to cover it up now." Lockhart's face twisted in rage. "No, you." But before he could finish, an explosion rocked the building. A deafening blast. The lights flickered, and the ground beneath them shook. Someone had come to finish what they started. Chaos erupted around them. The building's security systems faltered, the emergency alarms blaring as agents scrambled for cover. Keller and Williams took advantage of the confusion, drawing their weapons and taking cover behind overturned desks. "Go!" Williams shouted, pushing Keller toward the exit. "Not without you," Keller snapped. But Williams was already ahead of him, fighting back the incoming agents with quick, controlled movements. Just as they reached the door, they found themselves face to face with Lockhart, his gun drawn and aimed directly at them. "You think you've won? The world will never accept the truth," Lockhart said, his voice filled with venom. "The world needs order, not chaos. And I will stop you." Keller's heart pounded as he stepped forward. "The truth will never be buried. We'll see to that." A tense silence fell between them. For a moment, it seemed like everything hung in the balance. Then, before anyone could react, Agent Harper stepped forward, his hands shaking, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He lowered his weapon. I can't do this anymore," Harper muttered, looking between Lockhart and Keller. "You've destroyed everything, Lockhart. You're not the only one with power anymore." Lockhart's eyes narrowed, his voice rising in fury. "You're a fool, Harper. This is bigger than you. It's bigger than any of us." Harper didn't respond. Instead, he turned toward Keller and Williams. "I don't know if I can make up for what I've done, but I'll help you get out of here. Now, before it's too late." In the chaos, the four of them, Keller, Williams, Harper, and Lockhart, engaged in a desperate final standoff. Lockhart was a seasoned manipulator, but in the end, his empire crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. As they made their way out of the building, Keller and Williams could hear the sounds of police sirens and the growing protests outside. They had exposed the corruption, the lies, and the truth was finally coming to light. With Harper's help, they navigated the underground passageways to freedom. The world above them was changing. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Keller felt a sense of peace. They had done what no one thought was possible, and as they disappeared into the night, the truth was out there. It couldn't be buried. Not anymore. Weeks passed, and the storm that followed the exposure of the government's secrets rocked the entire country. Political leaders fell. Officials were arrested. Citizens rallied for reform. The country was in turmoil, but there was also hope, a sense that change was possible. Keller and Williams, now living under new identities, watched it unfold from the shadows. They had sacrificed everything they knew, everything they were, for the truth. And as the world began to rebuild, they knew their fight was far from over. But they had one. The truth had won. The truth would always find its way to the surface. And for Keller and Williams, that was enough.